those 2024 sermon journals. They are in. They're out here on the table in the foyer as you're exiting. Lindsay did a great job, and they're multicolored. So you can have your choice of what color you would like, blue, yellow. I think she said she took all the orange ones and took them to Tyrone, but I know there were some peach ones in there. So if you want a special color, you can sort through them and look out there. But those are out there. So make sure you grab one of those on your way out. Just again, by way of reminder, next week we are going to have 2 regular Sunday morning services, 2 Christmas Eve services in the evening, of course. One will be at 5 o'clock, one will be at 6 o'clock. And so we encourage you to, it'll be a crazy day. I mean, go to church twice in one day. It's going to turn into like a radical or something. So, make sure you keep that in reminder. Also, next week is our ugly sweater day. Some of you thought it was today, apparently. I joke. But next week, yeah. I don't know if it's still in the bulletin or not, but Lindsay put in the bulletin that John Poe was going to give away a cash prize for the best ugly sweater. I don't know if that's still in there or not, but she did make up some certificates that we can give to you if you'd like one of those as well. So, but yeah, it is the most wonderful time of the year. You hear me say it all the time. It is the most wonderful time of the year, not because of what's happening. It is the most wonderful time of the year because of what happened. And that's what we're going to look at today in Luke chapter 2. It happened in December of 2002. I remember this Christmas vividly. It was 21 years ago, and it was about a week before Christmas. And like my usual self, I waited till the last week before Christmas. And I was a little bit better. Typically, I used to wait till the day before Christmas. But the week before Christmas, I was trying to find Beth the perfect Christmas gift. And just to put this into context, I was in seminary at the time. We were just kind of newly married for a few years. Our daughter, Hope, was 1 year of age. And so in light of all those things that were going on in my life at that point, we didn't have a whole lot of money. And so I remember I was walking through the mall and I was thinking, what am I going to get Beth for Christmas? And everything that I saw that I wanted to buy her, I couldn't afford. And the things that I could afford, I didn't really want to buy her. And so I was just walking through the mall, and I remember I prayed. I was like, Lord, you need to lead me to the right spot so I know what to buy Beth for Christmas. And it wasn't long after I prayed that prayer, I came right around the corner, and standing there, staring at me on a shelf in one of the stores was a Chia Pet. And when I saw that Chia Pet, my mind immediately went to the old commercials from when I was growing. Chia, okay? And so I started singing that song. And then I remembered when I was a kid, at the end of the commercial, it would always say, it makes a great holiday gift. And so I said, well, I can't go wrong with that. And so I bought Beth a Chia Pet that year for Christmas. Now, you probably don't need me to tell you that was not one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. And I mean, in all fairness, I bought her more than just a Chia Pet. But I bought her a Chia Pet. And I remember that Christmas, she unwrapped it and she said, oh, a Chia Pet. And I said, hey, it makes a great holiday gift. And then the next year, Beth wrapped it up and she gave it to one of her sisters for Christmas. The year after that, her sister wrapped it up and gave it to someone else in our family for Christmas. And then a few years later, I don't know, 2 or 3 years later, I remember we were sitting at a family gathering. We were having a family Christmas party, and everybody had to bring a little wrapped gift for our gift exchange. And so for this year, the gift exchange, we all sat in a circle. Maybe you've done this before, and somebody read a Christmas story, and you started holding the package in your hands. And anytime the story said left, you would pass the package that was in your hand to the person on your left. Anytime the story said right, you had to take the package that was in your hand and pass to the right. And so read this story. It was a few minutes long, and packages are going back and forth and all around the circle. And then at the end, we all unwrapped our the packages that we had. And when I unwrapped mine, guess what it was? Yeah, you knew where this was going, right? I unwrapped a Chia Pet, and I said, wow, I cannot believe. I mean, how random is it that I was the one who ended up with the Chia Pet? And I just couldn't believe it. I was just stunned that had happened. And then probably, I don't know if it was the next day or the day after, Beth finally said to me, she said, that was all planned beforehand. Like we knew if you were sitting, we knew who had to start with the package so that we knew that you would end up with Chia Pet. And man, I thought that was random. There's been a lot of other Christmases where I've had some pretty random events. There was one Christmas in December that I lost my job and I said, man, this is so random. There was another Christmas, just a few weeks before Christmas, Beth was diagnosed with cancer. And I said, man, this is so random. There was another Christmas right before Hope was born in February where Beth had the ultrasound, or they did the little thing, and they called us back in. They said, we think there's something wrong with your baby's heart. And I remember driving to the doctor's office that day and I was thinking, man, this is just so random. And I would guarantee that there's probably some of you sitting in the room that this Christmas, you're experiencing something that just seems so random. Like it just kind of has come out of the blue. I can almost rest assured that all of us in this room have had some sort of random event that has struck us through the course of this year. It may have been a random event that has happened relationally, and you don't know why, your child has walked away. You're not sure why there's so much tension in your marriage. You're not sure why your friend is kind of like not even talking to you anymore. Some of you are experiencing random events physically, like that diagnosis that you received from the doctor just this year just seems to have come at just the worst time, and it just seems so random. Some of you are experiencing random events, maybe professionally, where things are happening at work, and as you think about it, you're like, why does this happen right now? This just seems to be so random. Like all of us experience these random events in our lives, which oftentimes leaves us asking the question, God, in the midst of all this, where are you? God, why do I have to go through this? What's going on here? God, don't you care about the circumstances and the situations that I find myself in? And if you've ever experienced that or are experiencing it right now, I want to encourage you today, because your story intersects beautifully with what happened on the very first Christmas. What happened in Mary's Christmas, which is the series that we're continuing on. We're going to, of course, culminate it next week as we finish up this series. But we've been talking about Mary's Christmas and looking at Christmas from Mary's perspective and reading the Christmas account from Luke chapter 1 and chapter 2. And what we've discovered through this is that God has done some pretty amazing, some pretty radical things in the life of just a simple teenage girl who lived in the middle of nowhere that would have just simply oftentimes just been forgotten from the pages of history so quickly. But because she was going to be the mother of the long-awaited Messiah, everything changed in her life. And this series comes from our memory verse, Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, for a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. Just to kind of bring you up to speed on the series to this point, we looked at the first week when the angel Gabriel came and told Mary, you're going to give birth to the long-awaited Messiah. And Mary was confused by that, and there we learned that we are to say yes to God's request. And Mary said there at the end of that visit by Gabriel, she said, I am the Lord's bondservant. Do whatever your word seems best. Last week, 2 weeks ago, we looked at the fact that Christmas magnifies everything in our lives, right? It's that time of the year that everything, if it's going good, everything seems to be better in our lives. When it's going bad this time of the year, everything just seems to be worse at this time of the year. And I encouraged you last week that really all of us have a decision to make. We can choose to magnify the good or the bad or just the traditions this time of the year, or we can choose as Mary did, and that is to magnify the Lord. And so today, as we come here to the third part in this series, I want you to see today the truth, take-home truth that I want to give you is that there is a reason for the randomness. Even though these things may just come out of the blue and they just seem so random in our lives, there's actually a reason behind the the randomness. Just as I was sitting there in that circle and I thought it was just ironic or random that I would receive a chia pet, but it was all planned beforehand. And here in the first Christmas account, we see that if you were standing from Mary's perspective or Joseph's perspective or any of the people who were surrounding them, you would have thought all of these instances, all these events that are happening in their lives just seem to be so random. But what we're going to discover is that there was actually a reason, all the things that seem to be so random. And could it just be that the things that have happened, the things that are happening, the things that may happen yet in your life that just come out of left field and they seem so random? Could it just be that there's a reason for all the randomness? And so we're going to pick it up here in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 2. What I'm going to read here are some very familiar words, but I don't want the familiarity of these words to be lost on you, because I want you to just transport yourself back 2,000 years ago and put yourself in the sandals of Mary and Joseph when all of these events were taking place. And we left off last week, and we left off there as Mary visited Elizabeth, and she gave that great first Christmas song. And then here we're going to pick it up in Luke chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. And on the surface, all of these things that we're going to read about just seem to be so random, but what we're going to see is underneath it, from God's perspective, who's working behind the scenes, that there's actually a reason to all the randomness. And so the first thing, there's actually three random things that happen here. And the first random event is a random decree. So he gives a decree here that just seems to be so random. And it starts in chapter 2, verse 1, and it tells us here, in those days. In those days. Now, you have to wonder, what are those days that he's referring to? And probably what Luke is referring to is everything that has just transpired in the last several months in Mary's life. If you remember, the angel Gabriel came to Mary and said, Mary, you're going to give birth to a child. And Mary said, well, how can that be? Because I am still a virgin. I've never been with a man. That is like physically impossible. And the angel said, hey, with God, all things are possible. And if you don't believe that, your relative Elizabeth, who had been barren her entire life and is now well beyond childbearing age, is actually conceived, and she is carrying a child now. And so after Gabriel left, Mary hurriedly, the scriptures tell us, went to see her relative Elizabeth. And at this point, Elizabeth was about 6 months pregnant. And Mary goes and visits Elizabeth, and the scriptures tell us that Mary stayed with Elizabeth for about 3 months, so maybe through the rest of her pregnancy. And then finally, John the Baptizer is born. And when he is born, people realize that everything that had happened in the life of John's parents was a sign that John was going to do some amazing things in his life. Because look at what it says in Luke chapter 1, verse number 66. After John had been born and Zacharias was now able to talk again, in verse 66 it says, all who heard them kept in mind, saying, what then will this child turn out to be? For the hand of the Lord was certainly with him. And so they said, hey, it's obvious that because of the miraculous things that have happened here in John's birth, that he is destined to do some great things for the Lord. It seems like the Lord's hand is upon him. And so Luke, trying to maintain that timeline for his readers, said, in those days after John the Baptizer had been born, and now Mary, several months later, was about ready to give birth. She's probably in her 9th month of pregnancy at this point. He goes on, he says, and now in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was the governor of Syria. Now, think about the timing of all of this. The timing could not come at a more inopportune time for Mary and Joseph. She's 9 months pregnant. She's about ready to give birth to a baby. And now this random decree comes out of nowhere from Caesar Augustus that all the inhabited earth was to go under a census. Now, Caesar Augustus in these days was the most powerful man on the face of the earth. Now, that isn't actually his actual name, but he was a nephew of Julius Caesar. And after the death of Julius Caesar, he became the new Caesar, the leader over Rome. So the word Caesar is actually a title. It means king or emperor. So when you hear Julius Caesar, he's Julius the king or Julius the emperor. And Augustus is a term that just simply means to be revered. And so basically, this man changed his name because he was the most powerful man on the face of the earth. And he said, everyone's going to call me the revered emperor, or the emperor who is revered. And so it signifies how much power this one man had, that he would say that the entire known world, the entire inhabited earth, was going to undergo a census. And this was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And then in verse 3, and everyone was on his way to register for the census, each to his own city. Now that one verse, verse number 3, shows the immense power that Caesar Augustus actually had. That everyone heard this decree, and they went to register for the census. Now, the thing is, Caesar Augustus had no clue about the purposes or the plans of God. He was far removed from all of those things. But God knew exactly where Mary was in her pregnancy. He knew exactly when the baby would be born. He knew the timing that it would take for Mary and Joseph to get to Bethlehem. And so here, this moment that just seems so random for Mary and Joseph, that this timing couldn't have been worse in their lives, that now they have to leave everything behind. They have to travel to Bethlehem. But God behind it all knew it. Caesar Augustus thought he was the most powerful man on the face of the earth. But he was being used by the King of heaven in order to fulfill the promises and the purposes and the plans that he had had. So he knew exactly when this decree needed to be made. God knew exactly how long it would take Mary and Joseph to travel to Bethlehem. He knew exactly when the baby was born. And so this event that just seems so random in Mary and Joseph's life, there was actually a reason behind the randomness. And some of you might be here this morning, and this Christmas, you've started on a journey that just seems random. You're like, it couldn't have come at a worse time in my life. Some of you are here, and maybe it's the diagnosis that the doctor gave you. Maybe it was a decision that somebody else made that you had no power over at all. Maybe it could be the demise of a relationship, but in any case, it just seems to be so random. But maybe, just maybe, God is starting you on a journey because he knows. He knows exactly where it will ultimately lead. And what we see here is that this randomness, that God may just have a reason behind it. So the first random event was this decree that came from Caesar Augustus. The second random event that we see here is the destination of Mary and Joseph. Now, it seems so strange that they would have to leave Nazareth and travel to Bethlehem, but what happened here was this decree that seems so random started to set Mary and Joseph in motion in order to fulfill the promises that God had made. In verse number 4, it tells us, Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child. Think about this again. Joseph comes home and tells Mary, we got to go. We're going to pack up everything we have, and we've got to make an 80 to 90 mile journey to Bethlehem. And we're going to go because Caesar Augustus has sent this decree that we need to be counted in the census. And my family, my lineage, my hometown is ultimately in Bethlehem. And I want you to think about this. This was not an easy journey. Like when we think about 90 miles, okay, well, I got to ride maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours in a car. But for Mary and Joseph to make this journey over 90 miles, they had to go across some of the most treacherous, some of the most dangerous, some of the most mountainous terrain in their region. This was not going to be an easy journey for them to make, because think about this. Mary was 9 months pregnant at this point. I have no idea what it's like to be 9 months pregnant. But I can imagine just how difficult this must have been on Mary to make this journey over 90 miles. Think about how miserable this must have been for her physically. I mean, they couldn't get into a car, so she either had to ride on a donkey or she had to walk. And I can only imagine that riding on a donkey would not have been the most comfortable position for a 9 month pregnant woman to be in. And even if she wasn't riding on a donkey, I remember when my wife was 9 months pregnant, she couldn't walk very far at one point, okay? And so it would take some time. And so most Bible scholars believe that it probably took Mary and Joseph 7 to 10, maybe even upwards of 14 days to make that journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And so it was probably physically miserable. I think about even the emotional distress that Mary must have been in. Here she is. She's in Nazareth. This is where her family's from. Her mom is there. Her relatives are there. All the people who care about her are there. And now she has to uproot everything when she's about ready to give birth and travel 90 miles away from everyone who loves her. I think about the financial burden it must have been. If it was going to take them 10 to 14 days to make this journey, they were going to have to stay places every night. They were going to have food in order to eat. And so I can only imagine that Mary and Joseph, who probably didn't have much means to begin with, probably scraped together every dollar that they had in order to make this journey to Bethlehem. And finally, I think about how it must have been psychologically demanding on Mary. Think about her. She's 9 months pregnant, riding on a donkey or walking, and had to be thinking, what happens? What happens if I go into labor right here in the middle of the road? What's going to happen if Joseph gets injured as we're making this journey? I mean, what happens on this treacherous road that we're on and, we happen to get donkey jacked or something, okay? Could have happened. This is the same stretch of the road that Jesus used to give the parable of the Good Samaritan and the man who fell into the hands of the robbers. It's the same exact road. And so all these things must have been going through her mind, and how difficult it must have been to make this journey. But Luke was quick to point out, look at what it says. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David. The Messiah was promised to be born. The Messiah was going to be a descendant of David. And Luke was really quick to point out here that they had to go to Bethlehem because that was the city of David. David was the greatest king the nation of Israel had ever known. And since him, there had never been a king like him. And now, at this point in Mary and Joseph's life, there had not been a descendant of David who had ruled over Israel for a number of years. And now here we are seeing that this random event was starting to put into motion Mary and Joseph in order to fulfill the promise that God had made a number of years earlier. In Micah chapter 5, verse 2, there's a prophecy concerning the birth of the Messiah, and this is what it says. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephratah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago and from the days of eternity. And this prophecy was not talking about David, because this was written 300 years after David had died. And it was written 700 years before the birth of Jesus the Messiah. And so here, Micah, through God's inspiration in his life, was prophesying that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Well, how's that going to happen when the woman who's going to give birth to the Messiah is living in Nazareth, is 9 months pregnant? But God started this random decree that from an earthly perspective seemed to have them go to a random destination in Bethlehem in order to fulfill this great promise. Some of you right now may be on a random journey that is physically taxing. It might be emotionally taxing. It might be financially taxing. It may even be psychologically taxing. But who knows? The destination where you may ultimately end up may be exactly where God wanted you to be, because there is a reason to all the randomness. But there's one third final random event that happened in the first Christmas, and not just a decree, not just the destination, but thirdly, the delivery. And what we're going to read here is just a very brief couple sentences. Its simplicity is almost staggering when we read it. If I were to describe to you the birth of my children, it would take me quite a while to describe everything that happened. And here, Luke does it all in about 2 sentences and shares with his readers about the birth and the delivery of the Messiah. It begins in verse number 6. While they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth. And guess what? She gave birth to her firstborn son. While they were there, we don't know how long they were there. May have been a few days, may have been a few weeks, maybe in just a few hours. We're not sure. But Luke said while they were there, and Mary would have given this story to Luke, and she said, hey, while we were there, the days were completed. The fullness of time had finally come for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son. Now, it's interesting to note that Luke made a point to say it was her firstborn son. It wasn't her only son, because Mary would eventually have other children with Joseph, but he was her firstborn son. You see, contrary to Catholic theology, Mary is not a perpetual virgin. She had other children. Jesus had half brothers and half sisters because, they had different dads, but the same mom. And so Luke was quick to point out that Jesus was her firstborn son. And he goes on. He said, he said here that she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths. Now, why would Luke point that out? And I think Luke pointed it out because it was normal. Though the conception of the Messiah was miraculous, the birth of the Messiah was just like any other birth. This was something that every new mom would have done for their newborn baby, wrapped them in cloths. And Luke is quick to point out that he was born just like every other baby. He had 10 fingers, he had 10 toes, he had 2 ears, he had a nose, he had 2 eyes. He didn't come out born with royal robes. He didn't have a halo over his head when he came out of his mother's womb. But Luke wanted to emphasize the fact that Jesus was born. And we read this and we're shocked by the simplicity of it all. But he went on and he said something that was even more shocking, and he concluded this narrative here of the birth of Jesus. He said, she gave birth to her firstborn son, she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Probably would have been a little animal enclosure that would have been behind the inn, because people would have traveled there. If you go to a hotel now, what's around the hotel? A parking lot, okay? And so this was the parking lot. They would have housed their animals in this little enclosure, and there was no place for them in the inn. Now, Oftentimes we think that the innkeeper was so mean and rejected that there's probably just no room for them. And so here she gave birth in this animal enclosure and laid him in the manger. And if we have this idealized thought that it's kind of the clean, swept county fair stable, it's not the case. It would have been smelly, it would have been dirty, and it would have been almost, to many people, would have been scandalous for a baby to be born in these conditions. But Luke said this is what happened. He was born. She laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Think about this. I just want you to think about all the events that have transpired in the last couple of weeks in Mary's life to this point. Things have just gone from bad to worse. First of all, this decree just kind of comes out of nowhere. We have to uproot everything. We have to make this hard, treacherous journey, 90 miles to the city of Bethlehem. We arrive here, and Gabriel must not have called ahead of time to get reservations at the Holiday Inn. Okay, I got better ones coming. Okay, so he couldn't do that, and so now they're in this animal enclosure, and she's giving birth to the Messiah. It's just gone from bad. Like we would expect, like if we were to make up this story, if we were to write this story, we would have had Jesus born to the elite class. He would have been born in a palace. He would have been wrapped in robes and tended to by servants. That's not the story God wrote. Because understand this. Jesus was not a man born to be king. He was the king who was born to be a man. And here Luke described what had happened, and that's why Paul would write in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. Although he existed in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Jesus was not a man born to be king. He was the king who was born to be a man. And in all of the randomness of Mary and Joseph's life over the last couple of weeks, there was a reason to the randomness. And the things that are taking you by surprise, and maybe right now you're living some events in your life in such a way that you would not write your story this way. But maybe there's a reason to the randomness. So, because all of that is true, what should you and I do? And I want to encourage you today as you think about the random events. And listen, I believe, I'm biased this way and I understand it, but I am biased in the fact that I believe God is sovereign over everything. He's sovereign over all the events of history. He's sovereign over all the events in my life. He is sovereign over everything in all of creation. And so because of that, I believe that there are no random events. There's nothing that happens that takes God by surprise. And so how do we respond to that? If that's true, how do we respond to that? And I want to encourage you today to walk by faith. Just walk by faith. I mean, that's exactly what we see here in this narrative of the birth of Jesus. None of this happened by accident. It wasn't an accident that Caesar Augustus gave forth this decree. It wasn't an accident that Mary and Joseph had to travel to Bethlehem. It wasn't an accident that while they were there, that the fullness of time had come and she gave birth to a son and laid him in a manger. None of it was an accident. God knew from the very beginning. Listen to how amazing this is. God knew exactly when Mary would give birth to Jesus. He knew exactly how many days, how long it would take them to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. He knew exactly when he had to put the gears into motion for Caesar Augustus to send out this decree. Now listen, we're talking about the first century. He knew how long it would take for the word of that decree to reach the people who were living in Nazareth. He knew how long all of that would take so that Mary and Joseph would be in Bethlehem when the baby would be born. And if that is true, everything that's happening in my life and your life that seems to be so random, that God knew it all beforehand. And just as he asked Mary and Joseph to do, he didn't ask them to try to figure it out. They didn't question, but they just simply walked by faith. And I've given you this before, because sometimes that word faith, it's kind of a hard term to grasp hold of. What is faith? Faith, it's a very simple definition. Faith is living like God is telling the truth. God, I believe what you say is true, and so I'm just going to live like you're telling the truth. And we see this in Hebrews chapter 11. It's oftentimes referred to as the Hall of Faith. And there, the writer of Hebrews described all these people in the Old Testament who lived by faith. Why did Abraham get up out of his hometown and travel to a place that he didn't know where he was going to end up? Why? Because he believed that God was telling the truth. Why did Noah build an ark even though there was no flood around? Because he lived like God was telling the truth. All of these great men and women of the faith, they just simply lived like God was telling the truth. And now listen, our faith is not in faith. Our faith as believers, our faith is in a person. It's in the person of Jesus Christ. And faith always, always, always leads to action. Mary and Joseph believed that God was telling the truth. And even though the circumstances in their life seemed so random, they just simply believed like God was telling the truth. I want to encourage you today. Whatever random event you are facing, I want to encourage you today to live like God is telling the truth. He's not left you. He's not departed from you. He hasn't fallen off the throne. He's not oblivious to your circumstances. But he's asking you to live as if he is telling the truth. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11, the Apostle Paul wrote it this way. We have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to his purpose, who works all things after the counsel of his will. The good, the bad, the ugly, difficulties, the heartbreaking times, the frustrating moments, the times that it doesn't seem to make any sense, Paul said he works all of these things after the counsel of his will. That God is behind it all. And listen, friend, there is a reason to your randomness. So as you leave here today, whatever random event you are facing or will face in the coming weeks and months, I want to encourage you to walk by faith. And you will be glad that you did. Father, we thank you for your word today. Thank you for the ways in which it speaks to us. We thank you for Christmas and how the random events in Mary and Joseph's life remind us that you are the author of all of these things, that it may not be the way we would write the story. It's not the way we would write the story of the birth of the Messiah. And for some of us in this room, it's not the way we would write the story of our lives. But we know that you're a good God and that you are orchestrating all of the events. You're writing our story in such a way for your name to be exalted and glorified and for you to work in us the ways in which you have decreed. So we thank you. I look forward to the ways in which you're going to work in us and through us for your sake. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.